Hello, welcome. Today I want to walk you through the report that I took to get put together about the evolving landscape of short-term rentals in our beautiful state of Michigan. And the reason I did this is I'm really on a mission to highlight the positive contributions that short-term rentals make in our state through highlighting the economic advantages, the benefits we bring into our communities, and really the position that we hold overall in the larger travel and tourism industry in our state. So we're going to spend the next few minutes just sort of walking through a bird's eye view of what it means to be part of the short-term rental industry in our state and what that really looks like. So a little bit about me. Hold on, let me get my controls here. So first and foremost, I am a short-term rental owner-operator here in the state of Michigan. I also help a few owners manage their rentals, both in the state and outside of the state. I very early on jumped into the industry as a side hustle to my day job as a coach, consultant, and educator, first under the umbrella of a training program that was based elsewhere in the country, and then eventually on my own as more and more people were asking for my help. I really have a heart for education, and that's a big reason why I do what I do. More recently, as I've gotten more involved locally in the state, I've become somewhat of an advocate, sharing information as I understand it with other folks to help them navigate regulation in their communities, as well as just improve the results that they're getting in their short-term rentals. I am a proud U.S. Navy veteran, let me spit that out. I grew up in the outskirts of Detroit in Garden City. I left the state for 5 years to join the military. I came back when that was done, finished my education here, and I have lived here ever since. I currently and have for the past 15 plus years lived in Ann Arbor. We have 3 children. 2 are adults. One is an adult who's married, and then we have a middle school and an elementary schooler. And about a year and a half ago, I was delighted to be able to leave my corporate day job and throw myself full-time into this industry. So we're going to cover really the ecosystem of travel and tourism and the role of short-term rentals within that in our state. I'm going to throw some numbers at you about short-term rentals. We're going to look at that in many different ways. We cannot have this conversation without talking about the role of regulations and legislation in our state. And I'll cover some industry trends that are maybe not specific to Michigan, but certainly are alive and well here. And then I'm going to give you 3 key takeaways that I want you to walk away from this presentation with. And so I want you to buckle up. We're going back 30 years. This is a 1994 station wagon. I am of an age. I remember a much older version of that station wagon rolling around in the back seat, not seat belted in. But we're going to pretend it's 1994. Our state has had a long history of hosting traveling visitors to our state. And if we were taking that station wagon up north, maybe we landed in a little community like this. This is on the Sunrise side of the state, where maybe there was a resort with a few cabins or motel rooms that the owner was on site. Maybe we just rented a little housekeeping cabin from somebody, but however it happened, we probably called up on our landline phone to make that reservation, or we even left the deposit the year prior because we'd been traveling to that particular location and staying in that particular home for many, many decades with our family. And again, we've been doing this for centuries, right? We have almost 3,300 miles of coastline. We are second only to the state of Alaska in terms of the amount of coastline. We know we attract a lot of visitors. By the way, if you add all of our islands, it's actually 5,000 miles, which is about the same as driving from Maine to Florida along the Atlantic coast, right? But things change, right? We know things change. And in 2007, maybe you know this story, a couple of guys were trying to make rent for their apartment in San Francisco. And what they wound up doing was, in advance of an event that was coming to town where most of the hotels were sold out, they thought maybe we can make some money by renting out space in our apartment, and they threw some airbeds on the floor and they created a website. That website was airbedandbreakfast.com. Of course, we know that today as Airbnb. And this was really the harbinger of the sharing economy, right? We share houses, we share cars, we rent people's time to go get our groceries, to go get our fast food, to drive us in their car somewhere. We share swimming pools these days. You can go rent your neighbor's swimming pool by the hour. This is the sharing economy. And so what this has meant for us in the industry was if you had extra space in your house, you could rent that out and you could make the mortgage. You could get enough money to make improvements. You could have a little bit of extra money that enabled you to cut back on your work hours and be more present at home. Whatever that meant, you were able to do that just because you had extra space. For people who had a second home or there was a family home they were trying to keep, you could rent it out in one of these booking platforms very easily. And you could offset paying the taxes. You could afford to do those upgrades. You could afford to keep it if financial struggles came up. And then finally, as often happens, where there's opportunities, investors follow. And so seeing the return on investment that was possible, we've had some investors come in and buy homes and turn them into full-time rentals and draw people into our different communities and overall help contribute to our travel and tourism industry. So I want to be clear when I'm talking about short-term rentals here, I am talking about those furnished rentals rented out for less than 30-day stays. That is a license for use. I am not talking about midterm or corporate rentals because from a legal standpoint and from a tax standpoint, those are lumped in with long-term rentals, right? And frankly, short-term rentals are a very different beast. I also want to acknowledge, and you'll see it in the numbers, while many of us think of our beautiful state and our coastline and our vacation destinations, our urban areas are equally vibrant and draws just as many folks to those areas, maybe for different purposes, but certainly is a vibrant short-term rental market as well. So we're going to pop in now and just check some numbers. And I want you to think about when I ask this question live, nobody gets it right. So unless you've been studying, you may not know. So how many short-term rentals are in the US? If you said 1.5 million, you're about right as of this time. And I want to be clear, I use AirDNA for a lot of my data. They are one of the older data clearinghouses. They've done extensive testing to try and ensure that their data is as correct as they can get it for us. No data is perfect, okay? So as of the beginning of 2024, AirDNA told us there was just over 1.5 million short-term rental listings across the United States. That represented a 17% increase in supply. Overall occupancy has decreased. Occupancy is the number of available room nights. The number of available booked nights divided by the number of available room nights. Or unbooked nights. And then ADR, which is average daily rate, that's just the total revenue divided by the total number of booked nights, okay? And that went up 0.5% across the US. Now, in short-term rentals, we don't always talk about RevPAR. It doesn't make as much sense for us, but certainly in the travel lodging industry, this is a key metric that is measured. It stands for revenue per available room. And so that's a way of, if you're a hotel or a motel with multiple rooms, you can kind of see what's your revenue per room. We do look at this, and I'm sure larger property managers definitely look at this because it helps normalize if you've got a 5-bedroom and you've got a 2-bedroom, how is it doing per bedroom, per available bedroom? And we know overall over between 2022 to 2023, RevPAR dropped 4.3% in our industry. So what does this look like in Michigan? You can see that as of the numbers, when I pulled them at the end of December, we had just over 22,000 rentals in our state. Our average revenue, so that's the total revenue brought into our state divided by the total number of available units, has stayed just under 50,000. Our average occupancy is 50%, which represents a 4% decrease since 2022. And our average daily rate is at $271, which has increased 5%. And you can see ultimately that decreased occupancy and that increased ADR have kind of evened us out in terms of our average revenue. Of course, this is average and this may not be your experience, right? So then I want to share with you different ways of looking at this data set. So the first is what are the top 5 markets in Michigan with the most short-term rentals? And I want to clarify, I'm using the term market as reflected by AirDNA, which means that main city and the surrounding municipalities, okay? And our number 1 most populated market was actually Detroit when I pulled these numbers in December at 1527. I'm sure many of you assumed it was Traverse City. I know I certainly did when I was doing this data, and they came in at just 1503. I suspect if I had pulled these numbers in the summer, that would have been reversed. So South Haven came in third at 869, which is quite a drop from that second position. Ann Arbor comes in 749, and Boyne Falls comes at 626. And again, you can kind of see we have a nice blend of urban markets and traditional vacation markets here. Now, while it's fun to look by market, I actually think it's more informative to look here. And this is a resource I want to share with you. The Michigan Economic Development Corporation every year commissions a tourism report. This map and this way of looking at our state by various regions comes from that report. That report is available to you. Some of the data that I'm using comes from the Economic Impact of Tourism in Michigan Report 2022, posted on that website. It is publicly available data. And I want to note that data is available to us, not just at the state level, but by each region. So if you're an owner operator of a short-term rental, you can certainly use some of that data. It gives us traveler behavior, demographics, trends that they're seeing at the regional level in addition to at the state level. Okay, so that's a really helpful tool to you in your efforts. So if we look at the total distribution of short-term rentals across Michigan, you can see that the most populous region is certainly that Northwest region, representing Traverse City and many of the surrounding areas. Also, we've got West Michigan coming in at 19.4%, and that entire west side of the state is really covering well more than 50% of the total short-term rentals. In all across us. Now, I want to note, it was reported just in February, which is when I'm recording this, February 2024, that globally short-term rentals are noted for continuing to take market share in travel lodging at 18.6%, which is up from 15.2 pre-pandemic. Now, if you look at our numbers, and I don't have access to the same information, and I'm also not an economist, but if you look just by volume, by number of hotel rooms and number of short-term rentals, we take up 19.6% by volume, but we are only 6% by revenue. And I think that metric tells a key part of the story of short-term rentals in our state, which is that we know more than 60% of the short-term rentals in our state are not available full-time. These are, owner run or, used by the owner, at least part-time, and really reflect the fact that we have a lot of second homes that we make available, or we're sharing our home, or we're, inviting people into our home only occasionally. Maybe the NFL draft is coming up. We have a lot of needs for housing folks. And so there may be people who short-term rent just for that event, or just for, in my neck of the woods in Ann Arbor, just for football games a few times a year, right? So another way that I wanted to look at the data, though, was where did we see supply growth? So, that 19% supply growth, where did we see that really happening? So I parsed the data to look at by percentage, but I wound up only using markets that had at least 20 short-term rentals as of when I pulled the data in 2023, because a jump from 2 to 5 percentage-wise is a pretty big jump, but that's not volume-wise a pretty big jump, right? So using that criteria, I looked at the data, and White Cloud came in with 311%. You can see all 10 of the markets that I showed here were well over 50% increase, but it was somewhere usually for most of them between 20 and 30 new rentals. Something I think it is important for us to think about, though, is a jump of 20 new short-term rentals in a city like Canton that has a high housing density is probably not even really noticeable overall across the community. But if you're from Port Austin or you're familiar with it, the housing density in Port Austin is not very high. And so that jump of 30 new short-term rentals might actually really be being felt by that community in the terms of an uptick in the number of tourists in that area. So the final way that I parsed out this data for us to look at was to look at it by average revenue. So this is in a market, the total revenue generated by short-term rentals in that market divided by the number of available units. And Union Pier came in at the top at 115 average revenue per unit. We have 5 cities in our state that all generated an average revenue in excess of $100,000. And of course, the economic impact of short-term rentals in our state, we know that $1.1 billion in short-term rental rents was transferred to hosts in our state in 2023. That's not what guests paid, but that's what hosts received. Assuming everybody's paying their taxes, which hopefully they are. I know Airbnb is paying them on our behalf, but Vrbo isn't yet in all markets. That would be 6% of that general use tax that was implemented in 2017, which is $61 million. Now, if we use that same economic impact of tourism report from 2022 and apply that logic to this report, and I would caution that it was not a study specific to short-term rentals, so there could be some variation. And we also know with economic impact studies like that, there's a lot of regional variation on these numbers as well. But I think it's a good just base level look at, in addition to the lodging dollars that get brought into short-term rentals, the additional dollars that short-term rental guests are bringing in here. So by that logic, we can assess just under $2 billion or so in direct income. That's not including the use taxes generated by short-term rentals in our state. And again, that only represents about 6% of the whole. But, it kind of brings to mind the small but mighty contributor, right? So I don't want to leave this without acknowledging, as we talked about density and we talked about numbers, there is a housing shortage in Michigan, and short-term rentals are often cited as contributing to that. But I want to put some perspective on this. So we know it was just published last month. These numbers change. But basically, in order to avoid that housing shortage crisis that we're already in, we need about 190,000 units. What we do know, there have been a couple of studies done in other areas, not Michigan, where short-term rental units were banned with the idea that we needed to fix this crisis around housing shortages, which is certainly not specific to Michigan. But what happens is, because the large majority of these units are second homes, or, they just don't return to the housing supply, right? So it actually, 22,000 is the total. So even if we banned all of that and they all return to the housing supply, that's only about 11% of the total needed. And we know that the majority of those don't actually return to housing supply because they're second homes. But I also think it's important to think about density as well. So Detroit is the most populous, but that's only less than a percentage of the total household units are short-term rentals in the city of Detroit. Whereas in Traverse City, they came in at the second most populous market, but reportedly it's somewhere between 7 and 10%, depending on the source of your information, of those household units in Traverse City are actually short-term rentals. So density makes a difference as well. So I want to wrap up this section just by talking a little bit about what some of the thought leaders in the industry are thinking is going to happen in 2024. One, we know it's going to be double-digit supply growth. Now, most of this comes from AirDNA's Outlook report, but this has certainly been reported by many across the industry, very similar ideas. We know that travel demand and demand for short-term rentals is going to continue to grow, but it's probably going to grow at a lesser pace than our supply is, okay? Because of that, we're anticipating that occupancy will either remain flat or slightly decline, but given everything else, we think ADR will increase modestly. Again, AirDNA's report was suggesting at most that would be a 2% increase. So we can expect much of what we saw in 2023 to continue in 2024 in terms of the short-term rental industry. So as we wrap this up around the numbers, we know that short-term rentals continue to grow across the United States and in Michigan. The numbers are telling us that we're finding that economic equilibrium as supply and demand in this post-pandemic era are evening out. Both urban and leisure markets are booming in our state. And we make a notable contribution overall to the travel, tourism, and lodging industry and our overall economy. And I think it's important to keep in mind that short-term rental bans are not going to fix the housing shortage. And I'm not saying that we don't have a responsibility to be at the table to help those conversations and those solutions, but it certainly is not the answer. It is a much more complicated issue. Okay, so I'm going to share some industry trends that have been talked about around. I think one that is mentioned in our industry, but was also mentioned in the tourism impact report for the state of Michigan, which is bleisure travel, because we like to make up words, business and leisure travel, bleisure. And this is where people travel for work and extend their stay for pleasure, or maybe they travel and they're on vacation and they stay longer because they can work remotely, right? Which is a great opportunity for short-term rentalists because we offer the ideal kind of situation for that, where you can have a dedicated workspace and still have plenty of living space and have a very homey-like atmosphere. Sustainable travel continues to trend in our industry. That's not going to go away. Ecotourism, having green homes, being thoughtful about the impact that we have on community. All of these things are very important and will continue to be important. The data tells us there's an uptick in luxury bookings in our industry. So there was a study that came out of, I want to say it was Australia, forgive me, in 2022. I came across it when I was preparing a different presentation earlier this year. And that study actually was asking the question, what are the drivers of people picking short-term rentals or hotel rooms? And it was basically like, there are not clear drivers, except there were 2 points where it was clear. So the ultra budget category of less than $75 a night was almost exclusively hotel based. And the luxury offer was at that time in that study almost exclusively in the purview of hotels. And when we think about it, hotels can offer that 24/7 concierge in person. They can, really introduce ease. And I think one of the reasons we may be seeing a little uptick in luxury bookings has to do with the next trend that's being talked a lot about in our industry, and that is the professionalism of hosts. So with the invent of these booking platforms, it's been really easy to have a side hustle. And we don't always know what we don't know. We're just going to list the places available and it's going to book, right? And so there's been many more opportunities and ways for hosts to engage with each other. There have been a lot more tools. And I think one of the things that it's also enabled us to do is sort of become professional managers. We have had, professional vacation rental managers, for decades, right? So the Vacation Rental Managers Association has existed for more than 30 years, supporting the professionalism of vacation rental managers. But individual hosts doing this as a side hustle don't necessarily always know. But there's a lot more tools and people interested in elevating their skills. And I think that the uptick in luxury reflects the fact that, hosts are understanding that luxury isn't just a nicely decorated place with a high price point. There's a lot more to delivering a luxury experience than just that. Hotels understand this intuitively and they deploy it well. And so it seems that maybe we're catching on a little bit as well. Unique stays, of course, in the short-term rental space. This is really something we excel at providing, and that there is no secret that we have lots of unique opportunities in our state. And the other thing the data told us in this past year is we're seeing an uptick in small and rural town stays. This was a kind of rural offering that I just found on Airbnb up in Menominee. It is actually listed by the granddaughter of the original owner. He was a lawyer who loved nature and art, and they have several little buildings on this, I think it was 40 acres. One of them's an art studio. It's just a delightful thing I want to go travel to now myself. And maybe you do too, now that I've shown it to you. But the data is telling us we're seeing more small and rural town stays as well. So overall, we know that short-term rentals actually fulfill a unique niche in the travel lodging industry, right? A lot of things we do don't scale. We're seeing in the numbers more luxury travel bookings in the short-term rental space, an uptick in small and rural stays, and leisure travel. Unique stays and sustainability continue to trend in our industry. And of course, the professionalism of hosts we're seeing that elevate the industry overall. So we cannot have this discussion without talking about regulations. So I'm going to just briefly mention, because not much has happened with this yet, but there is a slate of bills that have been introduced. The last statewide legislation went to lame duck and never got voted on at the Senate. So we have a whole new slate that also includes an excise tax, a statewide registry, a whole slew of things that we should be plugged into and paying attention to. But I'm not going to get too far into that at this point. What I want to share with you is, again, that bird's eye view of what's happening in our state. And so as you're looking at the screen, these are actually, at the time I pulled the data, the 20 most populous short-term rental markets in Michigan. And what I decided to do and thought would be the most helpful was to just sort of share some of the trends that we're seeing in regulation of short-term rentals across our state. So I took these 20 and I audited each market to see if they regulated short-term rentals, and if they did, sort of to pick out the trends and describe those for you. So 17 of the 20 of them do have short-term rental ordinances. A couple of them embed that within a larger rental property ordinance. But for the most part, they have a standalone short-term rental ordinance. I thought it was notable that 9 of the 17 have just in the last few months or are in the process of revising their short-term rental ordinance. So folks, some of these markets maybe had an ordinance in place and now they're revisiting it and making improvements to it based on what's going on in their market. When I did this, I had this big spreadsheet laid out here, and I was like just tick marking all the things. And so I had 3 buckets that really felt like they made sense for categorizing those. I've done a lot of strategic planning and facilitating for strategic planning. And so that's kind of what you do, is you look for the trends and you look for how you can categorize things. So that's what I did. And so the first bucket, again, for the purposes of this report, was what I called residential dwellings. So these were ordinances that would apply uniformly to any residential dwelling. So this is, building code. Like, do you have smoke detectors? Do you have egress? Do you have carbon monoxide detectors, right? All of those things. And then there was also ordinances that would apply universally, right? So anybody can throw a raver and violate a noise ordinance. So that noise ordinance would apply uniformly. And what we saw in doing this audit was often that the short-term rental ordinance would reference those ordinances or would reference those building code requirements to make sure that we as hosts and managers are aware that these are obligations in order to deliver health and safety to our guests, as well as being sure that we're contributing overall to the health and wellness of our neighborhoods. So the second bucket, if you will, is here, and that's the rental properties ordinances. So these are, if you're a rental property, these are things. So typically communities want to know if you're operating as a rental property. So they're going to have a permitting, a registering, or a licensing process that would apply to you as a rental property. And there's going to be fees associated with administering that program. Many of the rental property ordinances will go back to those residential dwelling requirements, and they are going to want to have a process to ensure compliance. So maybe they're going to inspect, or maybe they're going to require a self-inspection off of a checklist that they provide, but somehow they want to make sure you're aware of your requirements and that you're executing on those. Most of the ones that I audited had a requirement to have a local agent. What that meant varied, but most of them did have that requirement. Communicating to the guest or the tenant about what it means to be in our community, what ordinances apply for them, what their rights and responsibilities were, those kinds of things. And then the last sort of bucket are those regulations that apply just to short-term rentals. And so this comes in over zoning and land use restrictions or capping the numbers of permits. Some places have short-term rental specific occupancy limits. And then a couple of them had a requirement either for a complaint hotline for neighbors or a complaint or some sort of hotline for guests who could complain if they have an issue. So now I presented that very neatly, but I want to be clear, there was lots of variability in those buckets and how those were executed in these ordinances. So we had things like we're inconsistent in terms of what is a short-term rental, right? We have a lot of zoning variability from expressly allowing short-term rentals in all zones to disallowing them in many zones or capping them in specific zones or capping them across the municipality. I think a real opportunity, if it was even addressed, it wasn't addressed in a way that really clarified clearly, and that is minimal use. So if you're only going to rent it out for a couple times a year, do you have to jump through all the same hoops and pay the same fees? Or is there a different alternative pathway for you? And then also, if you're owner occupied, some places refer to this as home sharing. So you're actually in the home and somebody is staying in a bedroom that you're offering out. But how is that different if it's a accessory dwelling unit on your property that's a standalone, or maybe you have multiple? So I think there was only a couple that actually even addressed these points, and I think they're important points to address. And then the permit approval duration and the fees, I should reference, ranged. That duration was 1 to 5 years, and the fees I saw anywhere between $250 up to about $800. But here's what I'll tell you. I've read a lot of ordinances in my business across the United States, and I knew that the ordinances I saw in those more populated markets were even if we don't agree with everything in them, they were pretty well done. I've seen some pretty messy ordinances. So I decided to look in mid-range markets, and how I defined that, again, just for this report, was those markets that had between 50 and 65 short-term rentals. And I want to clarify as well here as we were talking about this. So the term market referred to the main market and the municipalities. Ordinances and regulations are municipality specific, so I only looked at the main municipality in here, not the area townships, as I went through and did this work. Anyway, so back to the audit I did in these mid-range markets, there was 19 totals, so that mapped out pretty well to the first set of audit I did, where there were 20. Of those 19, 9 of them regulate short-term rentals. But I will tell you, oh my goodness, this is where I did see sort of that level of variability and that level of, frankly, almost punitive regulations towards short-term rentals. So these were things like, if you're a short-term rental, 2 of them said you don't get on-street parking. They had pet leash laws. 3 of them had all kinds of ordinances around fire pits. And these were things I didn't even see in those larger ones. And certainly, anybody in a residential neighborhood should comply with courtesy around parking, around trash, around pets, around noise. Like, those are all things that should be required of all residential areas. But the way they were written up in several of these were not felt very punitive. One of them regulated short-term rentals as motels. And I will tell you that most people, or most inspectors who are responsible for motels and hotels, would tell you they're not the same, and that's probably not an appropriate approach. And then finally, and I think this speaks to resources, many of them didn't even really acknowledge the health and safety component, the building code component. Only 1 required an inspection. A couple did have that checklist requirement, which I think is really helpful. But this point, I think, speaks to resources, right? Because if you've only got 50 short-term rentals versus 100 in a different market, that 100 times $250 or $500 or $700 fee can get you more resource to administer the program. If you're a smaller market, it's much harder to administer that program. But I think it's still helpful, and anytime I would advise a township on this point, is it's probably a good idea to at least have a checklist that the owner is required to maintain on file and present if asked. That would be a low cost way to approach ensuring people are aware of their obligations. And so as we wrap up this section, obviously, we know regulations are highly variable. It is absolutely a patchwork. I think there is room to have some statewide legislation to make this easier for some of our municipalities, but I think we have to approach that very carefully about, not removing too much of the local control, but also if you do the ordinances and the planning correct in a community, that takes a lot of time. So we could streamline a little bit of that. I think midterm markets, according to the audit I did, were much more likely to have very imbalanced regulations. I would hazard a guess to say smaller markets. That's probably true as well. They just don't have the resources, the access to the information, or the time to really dig into all the issues, which is another reason I wanted to do this report. We know there's a lot of movement in communities around regulations, right? And of course, we know that there is some statewide legislation that's been proposed that could have a significant impact on short-term rentals in our state that we should be participating in those conversations and helping make sure that we get the best solution for everybody who has a stake in the short-term rental industry. So finally, I promised you 3 key takeaways, and they really tie into my mission to help elevate awareness of the positive contributions short-term rentals make in our state. And so if you are a advocate for short-term rentals in a small or more meaningful way, I think we should talk more about our niche role that we do have in the travel lodging industry in our state. Those unique stays, the ability to flex and offer lodging when needed and then return it to a second home when not. I think those are all unique aspects of our industry. Of course, we know that the regulatory and legislative landscapes are really changing, and so we really want to stay plugged into that. And finally, I think it is so important to just get connected with other short-term rental hosts and vacation rental managers. Because a unified voice is going to carry so much further in the industry, especially when it comes to regulatory and legislative issues. And frankly, nobody should be doing short-term rentals in a silo, right? It's much more fun and we can learn from each other. So I appreciate you staying tuned in. I have a small coaching and consulting business. I do some advocacy work on the side to help communities and individuals within them understand the regulatory pathway toward balanced regulation. But I also do a lot of work with short-term rental investors and owners and managers around understanding success, what income potential is, how to optimize for it. I help folks get their business running a little bit more smoothly. I do lots of custom one-on-one engagements, and I also do a lot of education through speaking, and I have a blog that I share with. I am based in Michigan. I try to do a lot of my work in Michigan, but I certainly work across the United States as well, and actually that's where I got my start. So I appreciate you stopping by. I hope this was valuable. If it was, I hope you'll give a like to my channel and show up on social media and connect with me.